Hello and welcome to another lesson of Arabi بالبيت. Over the next several lessons, we're going to focus on verbs. And this is arguably one of the most challenging, but also one of the most rewarding milestones of learning Arabic. And once you get a good handle on the verb system, you'll have about 80% of the grammar you'll need to be considered fluent. Let's get started. The Arabic verb system is divided into 15 forms, or awzan, as they're commonly referred to in Arabic. Now, forms 11 through 15, those are extremely rare, so we're not even going to worry about those. Instead, we're going to focus all our energy on learning the first 10 forms inside and out, because those will be the most common. Arabic verbs are divided into two broad categories. We have sound verbs and weak verbs. Sound verbs, or الفعل الصحيح, are verbs that don't have a waw or a ya in the root. And weak verbs, or الفعل المعتل, as they're referred to in Arabic, are verbs that have a waw or a ya in the root. Now, sound verbs, they can be regular, doubled, or hamzated, and weak verbs, those can be assimilated, hollow, or defective. And don't worry if this sounds like a lot. Today, we're only going to focus on Form 1 verbs in the present tense. And the good news is that Arabic is very structured. So all these verbs will follow a pretty predictable pattern that you'll be able to replicate with your eyes closed, inshallah. I selected verbs from each category, which will span most of the Form 1 conjugations you'll ever come across. Notice that the sound verbs don't have any waw or ya in their root, and that's what makes them sound. We have a regular verb like raqasa, meaning to dance, a doubled verb like habba, meaning to love, and a hamzated verb like akala, meaning to eat, one of my favorite things to do. Weak verbs, on the other hand, always have a waw or ya in their root, and that's what makes them weak. The first category is assimilated verbs, which are the ones with a waw in the first radical. There aren't any verbs with a ya as the first radical, which is why we only need to cover one example from this category, like wa'ada, meaning to promise. That emoji is supposed to be a pinky promise. Hollow verbs have a waw or ya as the middle radical, like ba'a, to sell, qala, to speak, or nama, to sleep. Lastly, we have defective verbs which have a waw or ya in the last radical, like raja, to request or plead, rama, to throw, and baqiya, to remain, like baqiya fil bayt. You may have noticed I refer to these verbs by their third person masculine singular conjugation, or the huwa pronoun, not their root. You want to get in the habit of memorizing both the past and present tense conjugations for huwa. If you know how to conjugate huwa, you'll be able to derive any of the other conjugations just by following the pattern that's specific to that category. And the most reliable way to get the Form 1 conjugation for huwa is by looking up the root in the dictionary. The best way to learn, though, is by doing. So let's get started by conjugating the verb raqasa yarqusu in the present tense. When I conjugate a verb, I like to start with an empty chart with only the huwa pronoun filled in, which I got from the dictionary. I'll go through each conjugation and then we'll break down the changes and understand how the verb transforms for each pronoun. Let's start with ana arqusu, anta tarqusu, anti tarqusina, huwa, which we have filled in, yarqusu, hiya tarqusu, أنتما ترقصان هما masculine يرقصان هما feminine ترقصان نحن نرقص أنتم ترقصون أنتن ترقصن هم يرقصون هن يرقصن. So verbs are made up of three components: a prefix, the conjugated root, and a suffix. The prefixes in the present tense never change. They are a hamza seated on an alif, a ta, a ya, and a noon. Again, these will never change in the present tense regardless of the form of the verb or whether it is sound, hollow, defective, doubled, or even hamzated. Be sure to memorize these patterns. The hamza seated on the alif corresponds to the ana pronoun. The ta prefix is used for all the second person pronouns like anta, anti, antuma, antum, antunna, and it's also used for the third person non-plural feminine pronouns hiya and huma in the feminine. The ya prefix is used for the remaining third person pronouns huwa, huma masculine, hum, and hunna, and lastly, the noon prefix is used for nahnu. Notice that the vowel on all the prefix is the fatha, which holds true for form 1 as well as forms 5 through 10. In forms 2 through 4, the prefix is going to change to a dhamma, but we'll cover that later. The last thing to notice is that the conjugated root, meaning the ra with the sukoon, the qaf with the dhamma, and the sad with the dhamma, held true for all the pronouns except for antun tarqusna and hunna yarqusna. Notice that in those conjugations, the sad now takes a sukoon, and that has to do with the suffix, which we'll talk about next. There are 5 suffixes in the present tense. There's the dhamma, which corresponds to ana, anta, huwa, hiya, nahnu. There's ina, which is exclusively for anti. The ani suffix, which corresponds to the dual pronouns. The una suffix, which corresponds to antum and hum. And lastly, there's the na suffix, which corresponds to antunna and hunna. This suffix is typically different than the rest. It's the only suffix in the present tense that begins with a consonant, which is why it behaves a little differently than the rest in several of the categories. When you are conjugating a regular sound verb like raqasa yarqusu, remember that the third radical, which in this case is a sad, takes the sukoon for antunna and hunna. So we say antunna yarqusna and hunna yarqusna. So it no longer has the dhamma that it did in the other conjugations. We're going to skip to hollow verbs next to follow the same order that's in the book. The hollow verb, or al-fi'lu al-ajwaf, is designated by a waw or a ya in the middle radical. We're going to go over 3 different hollow verbs, starting with ba'a yabi'u. Similar to last time, I look up ba ya ayn in the dictionary to figure out the huwa conjugation. So I learned that under the ba, we need to put a kasra. Then I start by conjugating with ana. Ana abi'u. Anta tabi'u. Anti tabi'ina. Huwa, which we got from the dictionary, yabi'u. Hiya tabi'u. Antuma tabi'ani. هما masculine يبيعان هما feminine تبيعان نحن نبيع أنتم تبيعون أنتن تبيعن هم يبيعون هن يبيعن. Now that we have all the conjugations, let's go over what changed. In the prefixes, everything remained the same. I highlighted them so that you can follow along, but the hamza on the alif, the ta, the ya, and the noon never change, and they never will change, but it's helpful to get used to this and recognize where these patterns are. The suffixes also haven't changed. The only thing that changed is the second radical. The ya remained on all the conjugations except for antunna and hunna, where the ya was dropped. And let's try to figure out why that happened. So let's take antunna as an example. In theory, this is what the conjugation should look like. We have the prefix, which I'm going to do in purple, a ta, and then we have the root, which we have ba, ya, ayn, and then we have the suffix, which I'm going to do in blue, as the noon with the fatha. We know that because the suffix begins with a consonant, it has to have a sukoon before it, similar to yarqusna or tarqusna in the previous example. And because we have the ya, which is a long vowel, and we know that it has to be preceded by a sukoon, and then the ba has a kasra from the dictionary, and then the ta has the fatha, which we know from the patterns that we've been studying. So what's important to note here is that we have a double sukoon, one sukoon after another, which is prohibited in Arabic, which is why we have to drop the ya, and then which leads us to the conjugation that we have. We have ta, ba, ayn, noon with fatha, sukoon, the ta and then the ba, and we have fatha and kasra. Tabi'na, which is what corresponds to antunna, but the same logic would hold true for hunna. Let's do another hollow verb example, but instead of a ya in the middle radical, let's do one with a wow. And so I picked qawala, which is past tense, qala yaqulu. And the conjugation you'll see is largely going to remain the same. أنا أقول أنت تقول أنت تقولين هو, which we got from the dictionary from looking up قawala, is يقول. هي تقول. أنتما تقولان. هما masculine. يقولان. هما feminine. تقولان. نحن نقول. أنتم تقولون. أنتن تقلن. هم يقولون. هن يقلن. Now, again, just to check our boxes, all the prefixes remain the same, so I'm going to skip through that, and the suffixes also remain the same. Now, we notice that in all the conjugations, we have the wow as the center radical, except for antunna and hunna, and the reason for this is the same logic as in the previous example with baya'a, that we had to drop the ya because of a double sukoon. Here, we have to drop the wow because of a double sukoon and replace the wow with a dhamma. So we have taqulna and yaqulna. The third and final hollow verb that we're going to cover is nama yanamu. This is called a schizophrenic hollow verb because the middle radical, which is a wow, disappears from all the conjugations. Don't let this scare you though, because even these verbs follow a very predictable pattern. We start the way we always have by looking up the root nawama in the dictionary, and we learned that the huwa conjugation is yanamu. Here we see that the middle radical, the waw, is replaced by an alif. So now we can conjugate by applying the same patterns we saw in the previous examples. Ana, anamu. Anta, tanamu. Anti, tanamina. هو ينام. هي تنام. أنتما تنامان. هما masculine. ينامان. هما feminine. تنامان. نحن ننام. أنتم تنامون. أنتن تنمن. هم ينامون. هن ينمن. You'll notice that not much has changed. All the prefixes remain the same, and they always will in the present tense, so I'll keep repeating this point. And the suffixes also remain the same. What changed here is that middle radical, the second radical, which is a fatha, disappears in the antunna and the hunna conjugations. And the reason for this, it's the same double sukoon logic that we saw previously. In theory, the antunna conjugation wants to be tanamna. So because we have the fatha, we put a sukoon here, and the alif, we put a sukoon here, and we know that the double sukoon is prohibited in Arabic, which I should put in red, prohibited, and then this becomes tanamna. Tanamna, which corresponds with antunna, but the same logic would lead us to hunna yanamna. Next, we're going to move on to defective verbs. These are verbs where the last radical is a wow or a ya. We'll start with the root raja wow, which corresponds to the verb raja yarju, meaning to request or plead. We start by looking up the root raja wow in the dictionary like we have in the past, and this gives us the huwa conjugation yarju. From here, we can derive the other conjugations starting with ana arju. أنت ترجو. أنت ترجين. هو, which we get from the dictionary, يرجو. هي ترجو. أنتما ترجوان. هما masculine. يرجوان. هما feminine. ترجوان. نحن نرجو أنتم ترجون أنتن ترجون هم يرجون هن يرجون. Quite a few changes took place, but let's unpack them one by one. The prefixes, like in the previous examples, all remain the same, but I'm including them here for your benefit as you learn to develop these patterns. In the suffixes, however, there was a slight change with the Dhamma. Notice that the Dhamma, which usually corresponds to the ana, anta, huwa, hiya, and nahnu pronouns, disappeared. You can think of this as the final Dhamma blending into the wow, and that's because we have the jim, wow ending with a Dhamma Dhamma. So this Dhamma wow Dhamma construct disappears and makes way for just a jim wow ending with a single Dhamma. The next change that we should look at is the empty pronoun terjina. Notice here that the final wow in the root disappeared. In theory, this conjugation wanted to be terjuina, but instead the wow and the ya blended together and we ended up with terjina, like we have here. And then the last change that I want to point your attention to is in the antum hum category. Here the suffix is a wow noon, and you'll notice that the third radical wow disappeared from this Here the suffix is wow noon, and you'll notice that the third radical wow disappeared from these conjugations. In theory, the antum conjugation really wanted to be ter. In theory, the antum conjugation really wanted to be terjuuna. But that's a mouthful to say, and so these two wows blended into one wow, and we end up with the terjuna conjugation, antum terjuna, and you'll notice that the antum tarjuna is the same conjugation as antunna tarjuna. But here, by highlighting the suffixes, you'll see that they're the same word, but they arrive to that conjugation through different paths. This next defective verb is almost identical to the previous exercise, except we have a final ya instead of a wow. The verb is rama yarmi. Now is a good time to pause the video to try to conjugate this verb on your own. We start by looking up the root ramaya in the dictionary to get the third person singular masculine conjugation huwa yarmi. From here, like we have done in the past, we derive the other conjugations. Ana armi, anta tarmi, anti tarmina, huwa yarmi, hiya tarmi, antuma tarmiyani. Huma masculine, يرميان. هما feminine ترميان. نحن نرمي. أنتم ترمون. أنتن ترمين. هم يرمون. and هن يرمين. Notice that the changes here are very similar to the ones we identified in the previous example. Let's unpack them one by one. The prefixes remain the same as they have in the past, but the suffix, the Dhamma, disappeared just like it did before. But now, instead of giving way to a wow, the Dhamma gave way to a ya. Also, in the anti conjugation, we lost the final ya radical. So the ina is already part of the suffix for anti, but this should have been, in theory, ter mi ina. So basically, the double ya here got synthesized into a single ya, and we ended up with anti termina, with one ya. We also lost the final ya in the entum and home conjugations. Here we have termuna. In theory, that conjugation wanted to be termiuna. But here, the ya-wow combination, the ya lost, and we ended up with a single wow in its place, which gave us termuna, termuna. Here also recognize that the kasra on the meme got converted to a dhamma. So that's why we have ترمون and not ترميون, which is a little awkward to say. We could use the same logic to derive هم يرمون. I hope you got this one right. For the third defective verb example, we're going to cover another schizophrenic verb, بقايا. It's schizophrenic because the final ya is hidden in the conjugation بقي يبقى, which means to remain, as in هو يبقى في البيت. We'll start this conjugation like we usually do, by looking up the root بقايا in the dictionary. This gives us the huwa conjugation يبقى. Note the fatha over the qaf. We'll come back to this. In the meantime, we can begin to derive the remaining conjugations as follows. أنا أبقى, أنت تبقى, أنت تبقين, هو يبقى, هي تبقى, أنتما تبقيان. هما masculine يبقيان. هما feminine تبقيان. نحن نبقى. أنتم تبقون. أنتن تبقين. هم يبقون. هن يبقين. Now let's examine the transformations that resulted from this conjugation. First, note that the prefixes, as usual, remained unchanged, but then notice that we lost the dhamma suffix. This is the case for all defective verbs. The dhamma will either get absorbed into the waw if the waw is a final radical, or it will be dropped in favor of the ya, or in this case, the alif maksura. The alif maksura is a result of the fatha ya dhamma pattern. In this example, the ana conjugation should have been, in theory, أنا أبقي, which you can tell sounds weird and it's actually not possible in Arabic. So instead, we get an alif maksura for the أنا, أنت, هو, هي, نحن pronouns. All the pronouns basically that had a dhamma for a suffix. Let's take a close look at the anti pronoun. Here we lose the alif maksura. So the combination of tabqa and the suffix ina results in tabqaina, which is a diphthong. Here we write the sukoon over the ya to note this structure. Anti tabqaina. The dual conjugations remain regular. We derive these by attaching the final ya in the root to the standard dual ani suffix. Let's take a look at the conjugation for hum. In theory, this conjugation should have been yabqa zaid una, which would have resulted in yabqayuna. But this leaves us with a lone syllable that starts with a vowel, which is not supported in Arabic. In order to make this work, we drop the ya with a sukoon and keep the fatha over the middle radical, which in this case is a qaf. And the result is something much more pleasant to pronounce, which is yabqawna. And the same logic can be applied to antum tabqawna. Lastly, let's check the conjugations for the feminine plurals, antunna and hunna. These remain regular. We simply add the noon suffix to tabqa and yabqa respectively, but when we connect the alif maksura to the suffix, which is a consonant, the alif maksura becomes a ya, which is why we end up with antunna tabqayna and hunna yabqayna. We've made it to the final category of weak verbs, which are the assimilated verbs. These are verbs with a waw in the first radical. This category has some obscure corner cases, but we're not going to worry about those. Most of the time, the initial waw is dropped and the verb follows a pretty standard pattern. Today we're going to conjugate the verb wa'ada ya'idu, which means to promise. I promise this lesson is almost done. We start by looking up the root wa'ada in the dictionary, like we usually do, to get the huwa conjugation, which is ya'idu. Notice that the waw dropped and the second radical has a kasra as a vowel. From here we can derive the rest almost as if this was a sound verb. We have ana a'idu, anta ta'idu, anti ta'idina, huwa ya'idu, هي تعد أنتما تعدان هما masculine يعدان هما feminine تعدان نحن نعد أنتم تعدون أنتن تعدن هم يعدون هن يعدن. There weren't many irregular changes. We basically followed the same patterns we have since the beginning of this lesson. The prefixes all remain the same, and the suffixes also remain the same. They all followed the consistent pattern of adding a dhamma, ina, ani, una, and na to the roots we've been working with throughout the lesson. Doubled verbs are verbs whose second and third radicals are the same, like habbaba. The form 1 conjugation of this root, habba yahibbu, means to love, as in ahibbu tasrif al-af'al. I love to conjugate verbs. Doubled verbs are quirky, but they're not difficult. When we look up the root habbaba in the dictionary, we learn that the huwa conjugation is yahibbu with a kasra below the ha. This is quirky because the stem vowel appears immediately after the first radical instead of the second radical as it usually does. From here, we can begin to conjugate the rest of the pronouns pretty easily the way we've been doing so far. As in, أنا أحب, أنت تحب, أنت تحبين, هو يحب, هي تحب, أنتما تحبان, هما masculine يحبان, هما feminine تحبان, نحن نحب, أنتم تحبون, أنتن تحببن, هم يحبون, هن يحببن. Surprise! None of the prefixes changed as promised, and all the conjugations followed a pretty consistent pattern except for the feminine plurals antunna and hunna. Here we split up the double radical, placed the sukoon on the last radical, moved the sound vowel to the middle radical, and added a sukoon to the first radical. And that's how we ended up with antunna tahbibna and hunna yahbibna. Everything else followed the same patterns we've been covering so far. Last but certainly not least, we're going to cover hamzated verbs. These are sound verbs with a hamza in any of the radicals, such as the verb akala yakulu, meaning to eat. These verbs are not mentioned explicitly in the book, but they're so simple to conjugate I thought I'd include them. We start by looking up the root akala in the dictionary to get the conjugation for huwa, which is yakulu, with a dhamma on the second radical. From here, we're able to derive the rest of the conjugations pretty easily. We start with ana akulu, anta ta'kulu, anti ta'kulina, huwa ya'kulu, hiya ta'kulu, أنتما تأكلان, هما masculine يأكلان, هما feminine تأكلان, نحن نأكل, أنتم تأكلون, أنتن تأكلن, هم يأكلون, هن يأكلن. For the first time in the lesson, one of the prefixes changed. You may have noticed that the hamza on the alif for the ana pronoun changed to a long alif. That's what you get when you try to combine two hamzas seated on alifs, one from the root and one from the prefix. Everything else, however, stayed pretty much the same, even the suffixes. So as you see, hamzated verbs are very straightforward. Just remember that if the hamza is located on the first radical, to combine the two hamzas into a long alif in the ana pronoun. This concludes our lesson on Form 1 verbs. Now, the best way to become an expert on these patterns is to practice, practice, practice. Commit to doing a few conjugations every day. And I find it helpful to use different colors to differentiate between the prefix, conjugated roots, and the suffix. And after many, many tries and a lot of perseverance, I'm sure you'll become an expert. Thank you for tuning in. وشكرا. إلى اللقاء.